Hey, I'm State Representative Rua Roman.
And I'm Senator Josh McLaurin, and this is What's on Fire.
So, we're starting with another week of What is on Fire because way too much is on fire. And we are going to start with the Attorney General's attacks on unfortunately disabled children. And if you think that I'm exaggerating, I'm not exaggerating.
So last time we did federal first and then state. We're going to give some love to Georgia and talk about state issues first. So Chris Carr is one of 17 attorney generals who signed on to a lawsuit. This lawsuit was filed last year, but people are waking up to what's happening this year. Forbes ran an article. Basically, the lawsuit is trying to target a Biden-era regulation that had to do with gender dysphoria in the first two counts. But the third count of the lawsuit, which is just as much a part of the lawsuit as the first two counts, says that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was passed in the 70s, it's decades worth of federal anti-discrimination provisions for people with disabilities. Basically, if you have a 504 plan in a public school, it means the public school has to cooperate with you based on your disability so you can get your complete education. So that could be like ADHD or cerebral palsy or any other disability you could think of, right? Not just trans issues. And Chris Carr has signed on this lawsuit that's trying to eliminate all Section 504 protections, which affects millions of people nationwide.
And here's the best part. We keep being told by Republicans that we are fear-mongering, that we are lying, but the reality is that we just want you to be prepared if this does end up going through, because just because his intention is to only go after trans kids, which is abhorrent all on its own, that doesn't change the fact that in black and white, in writing, they are attempting to repeal the entire section. And we brought receipts, we've been able to show the public about this, and it's actually because of your engagement and your outrage and your outreach that they are now responding, including mentioning one of our favorite people by name.
So. Well, I mean, I think Chris Carr feels threatened by this because he realizes that he stepped in it. So he's blaming California liberals and Democrats for trying to lie or do misinformation about the lawsuit. He's projecting because he is doing misinformation about the lawsuit to the families who can read. They can read the lawsuit. They know what it says. They can see that he's asking to eliminate all of these disability protections. So, in fact, this is some user engagement here on our videos because we became more aware of the issue because some of the families who were affected by this lawsuit commented on our last video and asked us to talk about it. So, again, we would love for your engagement. Let us know in your feedback in the comments on this video what you want us to talk about next week. But that's one of the big controversies happening in Georgia right now.
Yeah, and part of the reason we're doing both state and federal is so much of this stuff is intertwined. And please understand that your voice really does matter. The pressure you apply really does matter. It doesn't matter on what party. Once we as elected officials hear from people and it's multiple people about the same issue, it changes sort of where we spend our energy for that week, for that day, whatever the case may be. And the reality is that our government requires a little babysitting and it takes all of us. So, lots on fire, but we wanted to start with that one because so many of you have been asking about it.
And can I say something about hope and energy?
Yeah, let's do it because we need that right now.
So this is an important point, right? Is that everyone is demoralized because of what's happening with Elon Musk and the stuff at the federal level that we'll keep talking about in a minute. But I think one thing that all of us need, legislators included, is just this feeling of camaraderie and this spirit look, all is not lost. There's still a republic that we are fighting for. There's a lot that we can do to keep our energy up, to stay on top of the issues, to talk to your legislators, we'll talk to each other, and mobilize in the way that we have even just over the last week on some of these issues. So our advice, our message to everybody watching before we conclude this is, keep the faith, because the more energetic and the more we talk to each other about this stuff, the more that we can show everybody in our communities that the fight is still going.
Yeah, and we can't really end this either without talking to those of you who are either at risk of losing your jobs or are losing your jobs. The amount of disruption that this has caused. I think recently DOJ fired some folks at sort of one of the agencies responsible for keeping our nuclear facilities safe and protected. I mean, they are trying to now desperately hire people back because the reality is that when it comes to government, and this is kind of a running joke, but it's true, it runs on duct tape and a prayer. Some of these programs are being run on an Excel sheet that if it's not passed on to the next person, that program is over. And now we know that hundreds of thousands of people around the country are being impacted by these arbitrary layoffs. And, one of the biggest problems, whether there's talking about 504, whether it's talking about these layoffs in government, et cetera, is that they are trying to convince us they're trying to right-size government, I think is what the governor said, that, so much of this is trying to save money, and yet somehow none of the agencies and contracts that are being touched are Elon Musk's contracts. And it's so important that people stay engaged, because the reality is that outrage does work. This idea that nothing's going to change is just preposterous and does nothing but make their lives easier. So, you know,
what's that called? Obeying in advance, right?
Yeah.
Is that Timothy Snyder? This is the work on authoritarianism, right? That
Yep.
like all that Musk and Trump could ever dream of, that their best hope is that we will roll over and decide they're already winning. There's nothing we can do. Even if we make noise, nothing's going to change. Democrats don't have power. Like whatever the the defeatist motto would be. Let's go to the firings. Let's talk about, because we're starting to get into federal issues. So some of the high points or low points in terms of firings in the last week or so. I think Trump dismissed about 300 National Nuclear Security Administration employees who are responsible for overseeing our nuclear weapons stockpiles. Like, look, a lot of policy issues relating to nuclear weapons and deproliferation and all that. But at the very least, we can't fire the people who are maintaining the stockpiles, right? So I think some Republican Congress people had to go to Elon Musk behind the scenes to be like, hey, wait a minute, man, do you know what the NNSA does? So they desperately try to hire these people back, but they froze them out of their email accounts, so they couldn't find them at first. And then there's a lot more on top of that. There was hundreds of people from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration.
I was just going to say, it
who were
literally
fired.
reminded me of that. It's terrifying to fly now. And on top of this, Elon's like, well, we fired a bunch of people. Sounds like I need to bring some folks from SpaceX to take over. No, I don't want your people to take over the FAA. It was working just fine before you messed with it.
Right, and then you see these very public stories about crashes happening. I mean, it's very tragic stuff, but it's like at a time when the consumer confidence on flying is low, to be getting rid of probationary employees. And by the way, what appears to have happened is that they searched probationary in the title of the employees, right, the job title, and they ended up dismissing engineers and more advanced people who were not like new to the agency, but they were new to their promotion or their role. So they might have been probationary only with respect to a promotion that they just got, which means that they were like a seasoned professional that otherwise the government would have had a huge interest in retaining over the years, right? So that's really scary too. And here in Atlanta and Georgia, we are very deeply affected by 1,300 CDC firings. I know people personally in my friend networks who have been fired from the CDC. And again, this is not like bloat or fat in the budget. This is like critical disease response teams that are our front line against public health emergencies. And we have a governor, Brian Kemp, who couldn't even stand up for those people. When he was asked to comment on this while he was on his Europe trip, Brian Kemp said something like, well, sometimes government has to be right-sized. Right-sized? Come on. I mean, you're essentially crippling the world's preeminent disease prevention agency. And it's happening, come on, let's be real, because everything Trump does is personal, right? Like he got in a fight with the CDC during COVID. He didn't like that the CDC had its own messaging. And so this is his retaliation. It is not linked to any sort of real efficiency analysis. It's just, who are my political enemies in the federal bureaucracy if I'm Trump, and how can I get back at them?
Yeah, so there is a lot on fire. Just as a friendly reminder, the reason Ebola didn't make it here and didn't spread here was because of the CDC, right? And when we talk about what's on fire, we're trying to explain to you what these agencies are and what they do and why they matter and how haphazard all of this is. So one, you're prepared for the potential consequences. But two, if it outrages you, please, please, please reach out to everybody that represents you at every level of government. Because the more they hear from you, the more they realize how urgent this is.
And don't worry if your rep is not the same party as you, or if you think, oh, they won't listen. Again, going back to this like fatalistic, defeatist narrative. We just had a town hall for Rich McCormick in the 7th Congressional District in Roswell last night. I represent part of the city of Roswell, and tons of people came out. It was a huge story. People were yelling at him about Doge, whatever, basically saying like, we didn't elect Elon Musk. He shouldn't be the co-president. His crack teenage, team didn't go through security clearances, and they're compromised. I mean, that team, just as an update, now has access not just to sensitive Treasury records, not just to Social Security Administration records with all of our personal data, but now like cyber security infrastructure and some of our nation's most critical defenses against hostile global rivals. So like at the time when Trump and Putin have now gotten together in this unprecedented way to carve up Ukraine without Ukraine at the table, it seems like the U.S., specifically Trump, Musk, and Vance, are turning us toward an authoritarian bent where they want to be just like Russia. They want to have total domestic political control and punish their enemies, and they want to ally with other more authoritarian regimes around the country or around the world that do the exact same thing. So it's 80 years or more of United States global diplomacy and soft power that were just peeing down the drain, unfortunately, because of the whims of Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, you know, as they say, what is it? We're not going to comply ahead of time, but as I like to say, make me. So that's for, I think that wraps up for us this week's sort of What's on Fire. We definitely covered a lot with a lot of details, but as always, please let us know what you want to hear on our next episode of What's on Fire.